love, pain, truth.
The sound is what she remembers most clearly. Not the words, though they must have been spoken, and not the sight of his back retreating through the doorway, though that image is burned into her memory. It was the sound of ceramic shattering against tile. Maya was only 7 years old, standing in the narrow hallway of their small apartment in Columbus, Ohio, watching her father pack a single duffel bag. He moved with a frantic, quiet efficiency, stuffing clothes into the nylon bag, as if he were running late for a train he couldn't afford to miss. In the kitchen, just a few feet away, her mother stood frozen, clutching a coffee mug with both hands. Then, her fingers simply let go. The mug slipped, hit the floor, and exploded into a dozen jagged stars. That crash marked the end of her childhood, and the beginning of a life defined by absence. Her father didn't flinch at the noise. He zipped the bag closed, slung it over his shoulder, and walked out the door into a Saturday morning that felt impossibly ordinary for the moment it was destroying. He didn't look back. He didn't say goodbye to her. He just disappeared, leaving Maya and her mother in the wreckage of a kitchen that suddenly felt too big and too quiet. In the years that followed, the silence in their home grew heavy, thick with unspoken grief. Her mother never spoke his name again. It became a ghost, floating in the spaces between conversations, but never acknowledged out loud. Maya learned quickly that asking questions was dangerous. She saw the way her mother's hands would tremble when the subject of him even hinted at the surface, so she stopped asking. She swallowed her curiosity along with her grief, building a childhood around the vacuum left by a man she barely knew. She carried a quiet, confusing ache in her chest, a pain she couldn't name or explain to the teachers at school who noticed she had become unusually quiet. Survival became her only focus long before she ever learned to dream. Growing up in a low-income neighborhood, Maya understood the economics of absence before she could spell the word. Her mother, now a woman carrying the weight of 2 parents, took on 2 jobs. She spent her days serving food in a hospital cafeteria and her nights cleaning the empty offices of businessmen who had already gone home to their families. Maya would come home from school to a dark apartment, heat up whatever leftovers were in the fridge, and sit at the kitchen table doing homework under a light bulb that flickered threateningly. She never complained. She recognized the dark circles under her mother's eyes and the exhaustion in her posture, and she made a silent, fierce vow that she would never add to that burden. She became the child who needed nothing, the girl who was fine, the student who required no extra attention. In school, her teachers noticed a quiet intensity about her. While other children whispered and laughed, Maya wrote down every word the teacher said, her focus a survival mechanism. She was reading books about successful women who had risen from nothing, building a mental suit of armor piece by piece, preparing herself for a world she felt she had to face alone. By the time Maya entered high school, she had mastered the art of invisibility. But her intellect was harder to hide than her pain. She earned a scholarship to a prestigious school across town through an academic program, an opportunity that came with a hidden cost. Every morning, she woke up at 5 o'clock to catch 2 buses, traveling from her struggling neighborhood to a world of wealth and stability. The contrast was brutal. At the new school, classmates talked about their fathers helping them with calculus, their fathers taking them on college tours, their fathers teaching them to drive in leased cars. Every conversation felt like a small knife twisting in a wound she thought had healed. It was during these years that she started writing. In a journal, filling cheap spiral-bound notebooks with words she could never speak aloud. She wrote about the anger she carried like a stone in her chest. She wrote about the gnawing fear that she was the reason he left, that somehow, at 7 years old, she had been unlovable enough to abandon. She wrote about watching other girls hug their fathers at school events and feeling a hollow sensation spread through her body, a cold wind blowing through the empty rooms of her heart. The journal was her only sanctuary, the only place where she didn't have to pretend that his absence didn't define her. Maya graduated at the top of her class, earning a full scholarship to Ohio State University. Her mother wept at the ceremony, not just from pride, but from the knowledge of what it had cost her daughter to get there. College was supposed to be her liberation, but it quickly turned into a different kind of battlefield. Academically, she thrived, double majoring in psychology and business with a relentless drive. But emotionally, the scars she had buried for years began to rupture in ways she didn't expect. She struggled to trust anyone. When friends got too close, she pushed them away. When it came to dating, she gravitated toward men who were emotionally unavailable because that dynamic felt familiar and safe. When those relationships inevitably fell apart, she blamed herself, just as she had silently blamed herself for her father's departure all those years ago. She was recreating the original trauma, stuck in a loop of seeking love from people who couldn't give it. The turning point came during her junior year. A professor noticed something in Maya's writing that went far beyond academic intelligence. There was a depth of pain and understanding in her essays that suggested someone who had lived through significant emotional trauma and was trying to rationalize it. The professor recommended a campus counseling program. For weeks, Maya resisted, terrified of opening the door she had spent years shutting. Finally, she sat in a small, sterile office across from a therapist named Dr. Collins. It took 40 minutes of silence and small talk before Maya finally broke. She heard herself say out loud for the first time in her life, "I am angry at my father." It wasn't a shout, it was a whisper. But those 5 words shattered something inside her. They broke the dam of silence she had been holding back with sheer willpower for over a decade. The therapy sessions that followed were brutal. Maya had to excavate memories she had locked away and feel feelings she had refused to acknowledge. She learned that her fierce independence, her refusal to ask for help, and her compulsion to handle everything alone were not signs of strength. They were survival mechanisms. They were the defense strategies of a child who believed that depending on someone was an invitation to be abandoned. She learned that the anger she had been directing at herself for years actually belonged to him. Dr. Collins gave her an assignment that would alter the trajectory of her healing. She asked Maya to write a letter to her father. She didn't have to send it. She just had to write down everything she had never been allowed to say. Maya took the assignment home and sat at her desk for 3 hours, staring at a blank white page. When the words finally came, they didn't come gently. They poured out of her like a flood. She wrote about the morning he left and the sound of the breaking mug. She wrote about her mother working herself into the ground. She wrote about the dark bus stops and the cold mornings. She wrote about watching other children with their fathers and feeling invisible. She wrote about every birthday, every school play, every graduation where there was an empty chair that should have been his. She filled 11 pages, front and back. When she finally put the pen down, she sat in silence with tears streaming down her face, feeling simultaneously destroyed and reborn. She didn't send the letter, but keeping it felt like carrying a weapon she had forged from her own pain. After graduating from college, Maya channeled that pain into purpose. She built a career as a motivational speaker and life coach, working specifically with young women who had grown up without fathers. She traveled across the country, standing in front of crowds in schools, community centers, and conferences. Her message was always the same. She told these young women that their worth was never determined by someone else's decision to leave. She told them that the absence of a parent was a wound, but it did not have to become their identity. She spoke the words she wished someone had told her when she was 7 years old, sitting alone in that apartment, wondering if she was unlovable. Her work gained rapid attention. Magazines featured her. Television shows invited her. People called her inspiring and strong. She accepted those labels publicly, but privately, she still carried a small, quiet question that her success, her therapy, and her journals had never fully resolved. Why did he leave? She had made peace with not knowing, but she eventually learned that peace and resolution are not the same thing. Then, one Tuesday evening, the past caught up with her. Maya was at a book signing for her first published book when a woman approached her table. She was older, perhaps in her 60s, with deep lines etched into her face and hesitant eyes. She introduced herself as Carolyn and said she was the sister of Maya's father. Maya felt the room tilt. She had never met this woman. She hadn't known her father had a sister. Carolyn stood there holding a worn, yellowed envelope and said softly that she had been looking for Maya for a long time. She explained that Maya's father, Raymond, was living in a small town in West Virginia. He was sick, and he had been asking about her. He wanted to see her. Maya stared at the envelope without reaching for it. Every instinct she had honed over years of self-preservation screamed at her to walk away. She had built an empire without this man. She had survived, thrived, and become extraordinary without his presence, his guidance, or his love. Why would she open a door she had spent decades trying to seal shut? Maya didn't give Carolyn an answer that night. She took the envelope home and placed it on her kitchen counter, where it sat untouched for 3 weeks. It became a presence in her home, silent and heavy with the weight of 20 years. She passed it every morning while making coffee, every evening while cooking dinner. Finally, she called Dr. Collins. They talked for 2 hours. Maya admitted she was terrified that seeing him would undo all the healing she had worked so hard to achieve. Dr. Collins reminded her that true healing does not break when confronted with the source of the wound. She told Maya that avoiding the encounter might feel like safety, but it was actually a cage. Those words echoed in Maya's mind. She realized that no matter how far she had come, there was still a part of her that was 7 years old, standing in that hallway, waiting for someone to tell her it wasn't her fault. She opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in shaky handwriting and a phone number. The letter was short. Raymond wrote that he knew he had no right to ask for anything. He wrote that leaving was the worst decision of his life. He wrote that he had been sick with regret every single day since. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He just wanted to see her face one time before he died. Maya read the letter 4 times. On a Saturday morning in October, she drove to West Virginia. The 3-hour drive felt like the longest journey of her life. She passed through small towns and rolling hills, thinking about her mother's tired hands, the 2 buses in the dark, and the 11-page letter she had written in college. She realized she was about to be tested on her own words, and the thought terrified her. She arrived at a small house on a quiet street and sat in her parked car for 20 minutes before she could move. Then the front door opened and Carolyn stepped onto the porch, waving gently. Maya took a breath that felt like it came from the soles of her feet and stepped out of the car. The house smelled like old wood and coffee. Carolyn led her to a small living room where a man sat in a recliner near a window. Raymond was thinner than she expected, older than his years, with gray hair and eyes that dropped the moment they saw her. He looked broken in a way that surprised her. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, and in every version, she was the one who looked broken. But standing there, she realized she was not the broken one anymore. Maya sat across from him and said nothing for a long time. Raymond tried to speak twice and stopped. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said her name. Maya! The sound of her name in his mouth felt foreign, painful, and strangely familiar all at once. She looked at him steadily and said, I have been carrying what you did to me since I was 7 years old. She told him about the morning he left. She told him about the broken mug. She told him about her mother's 2 jobs and the 2 buses. She told him about every birthday, every graduation, every empty chair. She told him about the years of therapy it took to stop blaming herself for his decision. She told him about the young women she helped who were drowning in the same pain. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She spoke with a calm and precision that came from years of knowing exactly what she wanted to say. Raymond listened without interrupting, tears falling continuously down his face, making no effort to wipe them away. When she finished, Raymond spoke for an hour. He told her he had been struggling with severe depression and alcoholism when he left, and he truly believed his family would be better off without him. He was too proud and too ashamed to come back. He told her he had tried to reach out once through a relative but was told her mother didn't want him near Maya. Then, he did something that shattered her expectations. He reached into a box beside his chair and pulled out a stack of newspaper clippings and printed articles. He told her he had followed her career from a distance, reading everything he could find about her. He showed her photos of her speaking events that he had kept in a box by his bed. He had been watching her succeed from the shadows for years, carrying his own guilt like a life sentence. Maya looked at the box and felt something she didn't anticipate. It wasn't forgiveness and it wasn't relief. It was recognition. She saw that the man in front of her was not a monster, but a deeply flawed and broken person who had made a devastating choice and spent the rest of his life drowning in the consequences. Understanding his pain didn't erase hers. It simply sat beside it. Maya did not forgive Raymond that day. She told him clearly that forgiveness was not something she could give him in a single afternoon, and she wasn't sure she ever would. She told him she had spent too many years building herself from the rubble he left behind to pretend that everything was okay now. But she also told him something that surprised even her. She said, "Thank you." She thanked him for leaving because the woman she became was forged in the fire of his absence, and she wouldn't trade who she was for a childhood with a father who didn't have the strength to stay. She told him his leaving taught her to rely on herself, and while that came with a cost, it gave her a resilience that saved her life. She told him she hoped he found peace, but she was not the person who could give it to him. Raymond nodded, saying he understood and that hearing her speak made him prouder than he had any right to feel. Maya stood up to leave, but paused at the door. She turned back and told him that if there was anything after this life, she hoped he would find the version of himself that could have been the father she deserved, and she hoped that version knew what he missed. Then she walked out, got into her car, and drove home. The drive back was different. Maya didn't feel lighter, but she felt complete. The question that had lived inside her for over 20 years was finally answered. The answer didn't fix everything, but it filled a gap that had been open since she was 7. In the weeks that followed, Maya returned to her work with a depth and power that surprised even her audiences. She no longer spoke only about surviving abandonment. She spoke about confronting the source of your deepest pain and finding that you are bigger than the thing that tried to break you. She told people that strength is not the absence of pain. It is the willingness to walk directly into the place where your pain lives and stand there without running. 6 months after that visit, Carolyn called to tell Maya that Raymond had passed away. Maya attended the funeral quietly, standing at the back of a small church. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She simply honored the complexity of a relationship that had shaped her entire existence. Afterward, she drove to a park and sat on a bench, looking at the sky. She thought about the little girl who used to sit alone in an apartment, wondering if she was unlovable, and she felt an overwhelming tenderness for that child. She wished she could go back and tell her that the empty chair would not define her. Maya eventually founded an organization called Full Chair, dedicated to supporting children and young adults who grew up in fatherless homes. The name came from the image that had haunted her life, the empty chair at every event. Through Full Chair, she provided mentoring, therapy resources, and community for thousands of young people. The organization grew rapidly, expanding to multiple cities and gaining national recognition. Maya was even invited to speak at the White House. Her story spread beyond the United States. She received messages from people in over 40 countries, from a woman in Brazil who had carried guilt for 30 years to a teenager in London who put down a blade after hearing Maya speak. She kept a folder on her computer called Evidence, filled with these stories, reading them late at night in awe of what happens when someone decides their wound won't be the end of their story. Years later, a journalist asked Maya what she would say to her father if she could speak to him one more time. Maya was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "I would tell him that he gave me the greatest gift anyone could give without meaning to. He gave me the experience of having nothing, which taught me how to build everything. He gave me the experience of being alone, which taught me how to find my own voice." She paused. "I would tell him that I spent years thinking I was missing something because he left, but I realized that what I was missing was the belief that I was enough on my own. And once I found that, there was nothing he could have given me that would have been better." That interview was read by Maya's mother at the kitchen table of the same apartment where Raymond had walked out decades earlier. She set the paper down, looked at the empty chair at the head of the table, and for the first time in 25 years, she cried openly, releasing something she had held in her body for a lifetime. When Maya came to visit the next weekend, her mother hugged her at the door longer than she ever had before and whispered, "You were always enough." Those 3 words were all Maya ever needed to hear, and they came from the person who had been there the entire time, the person who stayed.